Hello. After receiving some feedback on the previous video, and with 3.28 around the corner, I would like to give another go at talking about the Assassin rework, and my issues with it, and my issues with Assassin in general. For the sake of this video, I'm only going to be covering Assassin's defenses, and my goal is to try to consolidate and organize my thoughts a little bit better. Um, and hopefully uh, present my criticisms and issues and solutions in a little bit more of a thoughtful way. In order to talk about Assassin's defenses, I do want to cover uh, defensive layers in PoE a little bit. And because in PoE we like to talk about things in trinities, I'm going to keep that tradition and I'm going to talk about defensive layers, or the holy trinity of defensive layers. Uh, most builds, in order to get extremely tanky, they need to have these three things, which is avoidance layers, mitigation, and recovery. And I'm going to be breaking these into standard and non-standard. And so you might look at a build and you go, oh, well, it's all in on recovery or it's all in on mitigation. But what you may not realize is that there are actually non-standard mitigation layers or non-standard defensive layers that are within the build that you may not recognize, right? Um, with that said, I would also like to talk about immunity real quick here. Some people put in avoidance, some people put in mitigation, some people keep it separate. For the sake of this video, I'm going to keep it separate. Just know that immunity is effectively saying whatever the mechanic I'm immune to, I'm just not engaging with it. Right? I'm completely ignoring the mechanic. And you can just keep that in the back of your head as we discuss the other three layers. Now, avoidance, a brief overview of what an avoidance layer is effectively it's a layer that is before the hit happens, right? So it is calculating your uh, chance to avoid taking damage effectively, right? And most avoidance layers back in the day of PoE were true avoidance, which basically meant you rolled a dice, and if you rolled high enough, you just did not get hit. And this was a balance nightmare for GGG. So eventually they changed it to what is the current standard of avoidance layers in Path of Exile as of the current patch, which is entropy effects. So whether it be elusive, evasion, right, which are the two main forms of avoidance layers that you see. As far as the standard avoidance layers go, they lose their effectiveness over time, or a better way to look at it is they delay how long it takes you to get hit. Elusive directly loses effectiveness over time, has to reach zero in order to refresh, um, and it loses the chance to avoid the hit as the effectiveness of your elusive goes down. And likewise, when it refreshes, it goes back to the maximum amount that you have it scaled to. There are ways to refresh it with the Oshabi Bloodline and the Anoint, but those are only after they've reached a certain level of effectiveness. So let's say you have 300% for elusive, right? Well, the Oshabi Bloodline says when it reaches 100% effectiveness, then you have a chance of refreshing it. And it's not guaranteed to refresh, just a chance to refresh, if I remember correctly. Now, at 100% effectiveness, elusive has about like the 15% chance to dodge. It can go up to 81%, but almost no one is ever going to hit that number realistically. But 70 to 75% is fairly reasonable. Evasion is effectively an accuracy check. Basically, it's saying, hey, if your evasion is higher than the enemy's accuracy, then you roll the dice, and if you roll high enough, you dodge the attack. However, eventually you will be hit. That is the case for both of these. That is why I say view them as more so delaying how long it takes you to get hit, not avoiding the hit entirely. Spell dodge, again, dodge is a mechanic of a bygone era. The only way to get spell dodge in the game is through acrobatics, which converts spell suppression into spell dodge, but at a certain ratio and only to a maximum of 75%. This is a technically true avoidance layer, or like the old-fashioned avoidance layer, where if you roll the dice and you roll high enough 75% of the time, you will completely mitigate the hit. You don't see many builds use it these days, and there's a few reasons for that, unless they're like super hyper specialized in mapping. Just mitigating the hit is usually better. Now, I'm going to quickly cover the non-standard stuff here. So in the non-standard category, we have AoE, movement speed, DPS, and debuffs. Debuffs are things like blind. You'll see debuffs in mitigation as well. That's effectively just, putting any sort of hex or something that reduces the enemy's damage output or anything like that, right? But for avoidance, think of blind, think of like reducing accuracy, whatnot. But specifically AoE, movement speed, and DPS. We don't really think of these as avoidance layers, but they effectively are, right? If, let's say, your character covers the entire screen with their ability, so whenever you press your ability, it covers the entire screen, and you have enough DPS to one-shot everything in the game, or in the map, I should say, well, you're never going to get hit, right? Because you're basically killing everything that's on your screen, therefore nothing can get close enough to hit you. And if you're fast enough, then you can avoid all the stuff on the ground and projectiles and things that are being thrown at you. So even though you might look at a build and go, oh, that has no avoidance layer, it technically does, right? It will just be in the form of either an AoE, damage, or movement speed. All right, moving on to mitigation. Now, in the standard, you have block, armor, ward, spell suppression, resistances, and fortify. Resistances and armor will work in a similar manner, where basically they say up to a maximum 90%. I think it's like 75 default for resistances, but then you can overcap them to 90. And then armor by default is 90, and it cannot be overcapped. Basically what it says is as long as you're let's say you have 75% resistances, if you take a damage from that hit, or you take a hit of that resistance type, right, 75% of the damage will be mitigated. It's the same for armor. You take a fizz hit, and let's say you have 90% armor, 90% of the damage is mitigated based off of your armor. I believe armor has a slightly different calculation than just standard resistances. There's the entire wiki article, as well as like a bunch of documentation and like the Forbidden Trove and stuff with like formulas and things like that. If you want more info on that, I highly recommend those sources. That is not a rabbit hole I'm interested in getting into in this video. Same will apply to like ward. Ward is effectively saying however big your ward is, doesn't matter the amount of damage, it will block that much damage for one hit. So if you have a 2000 ward and you take 1 damage, the ward still breaks. but it will block that 1 damage hit. However, if you take 2001 damage and you have 2000 ward, you will take 1 damage when you take that hit, and the ward will break. There's mechanics in the games to keep the ward infinitely up or to refresh it a lot faster. It has had its place in the PoE history as far as builds go. However, it is not that popular of a build archetype currently in the league, outside of, I think, Night Grips and Ward looping. Block is like the creme de la creme of mitigation, where basically it's like the old avoidance layers. You roll the dice when you get hit, and if you roll high enough, you completely avoid the hit. Some of the tankiest builds you will see will be using block in their defensive layers. Spell suppression is what replaced spell dodge. And effectively, it's basically saying you get hit with the spell, and post nerf in the current patch, 40% of the hit is completely mitigated. You take 60%. Now, the non-standard types of mitigation would be damage conversion, right? So let's say you're taking a physical hit and your CI, and you have something that says 50% of the physical damage you take is taken as chaos instead. Well, then you'll take that 100% of that hit, you'll take 50% of it, and then 50% of it is now taken as chaos, which you're immune to, therefore completely mitigated. This applies to other forms as well. You can see it for like resistances, something like Fizz taken as elemental or elemental taken as chaos. Raw hit pool. We saw this in 3.26 where we had certain builds and build archetypes having HP pools so large that when paired with their recovery and their mitigation sources, there was no single hit in the game that could one-shot them. So what would happen is they would take the hit, their hit pool would they would mitigate some portion of the hit or whatever, and then they would immediately recover it back to full, effectively making them immortal. And as I discussed previously, debuffs. So think about reduce like any sort of debuff that lowers the enemy's damage, right, or the mob's damage against you. That would be a form of mitigation. All right, recovery layer. So in the standard, there's recharge, recoup, regen, flasks, and gain. I don't have leech on here, but technically you could put that in like the regen category. It's just a little bit more of a conditional regen than comparatively to just standard regen. So if you look at standard regen, it basically says that per tick you gain X amount of whether it be life, mana, or whatever, regenerated in that single tick. And over time, every tick, you will receive that amount, regardless of like what's happening, right? So regen prevents a lot of shotgunning effects, but it does not prevent any sort of like one shots, right? Technically, there are I won't get into that right now. Actually, that's falls under like the non-standard category. So just know, generally speaking, as far as regen goes, tick happens, you gain the amount that you're regenning in that tick. Recoup is whenever you get hit, you will recoup whatever percentage your recoup is of that damage back, and it can infinitely stack with itself, which means, let's say you have 100% recoup. If you get hit once, over the next 4 seconds, which can be shortened to 3, but for sake of argument, we'll say 4 seconds, or sake of explanation, not argument, Over the next 4 seconds, you will gain back that full amount of damage that you took over the course of 4 seconds. And this can infinitely stack, which means if you get hit 100 times, then over the next 4 seconds, you will regen all 100 of those hits back to full. Recharge generally only applies to energy shield, but there's ways to make it apply to health. What it just says is after a certain period of time, if you have taken no damage, you just recharge to full, right? And recharge rate can be affected by recovery modifiers and stuff like that. And there's ways to make it so it will ignore the damage aspect of it. So like if your recharge starts and you take damage, it won't stop the recharge, it'll just keep going. Flasks, pretty straightforward. Click flask, gain either mana, health, or whatever else that you're recovering with the flask. The energy shield normally can't be used with a flask, but there's again ways to make it happen. And gain effects, we see these in two forms, where it's gain on or gain when. So Defiance of Destiny is a gain when effect, right? When you're hit, you immediately gain the percentage of health immediately. Before calculation goes through, you just, boom, it's there. It's yours, right? So same thing with the gain on effects. The moment you, let's say, gain on hit, for example, the moment you hit something, you immediately gain the effect, right? So let's say it's gain on life, you gain 40 life, right? On hit. So the moment you hit, immediately you get 40 life. It's instant. There is no period like with Leech or with Recoup that you had to wait in order to get the full amount. Now, in the non-standard category, we have Temporal Rift. And this kind of goes into the kind of unusual part about how Temporal Rift works. Temporal Rift isn't popular because PoE players hate buttons, and Temporal Rift is another button you have to click. But effectively what Temporal Rift says is it calculates your previous status for a certain period of time and refreshes over a certain amount. And as long as you're clicking it before the recovery or the refresh interval of Temporal Rift, you will go back to whatever state you were in previously. So if you start and enter the map at full health, you go in, and let's say you get reduced to 1 health, you can click the button and go back to full health, right? Likewise, if you were at 1 health at that point in time that the calculation was refreshed, and you are at full health and you click the button, you will go down to 1 health. This, if my understanding of it is correct, and from what I have seen of Temporal Rift in like the few gimmicky builds that do use it, you can technically avoid being one shot. Because as long as the tick has not calculated that you are dead and you click the button fast enough, it will put you back to the previous state, effectively unconditionally. It is also the only form of recovery that bypasses anti-recovery or no recovery modifiers. Another thing to consider, as far as I'm aware. Now, I don't claim to be like 100% knowledgeable of every aspect of PoE. I'm very much learning new things every day with this game. So if I get anything wrong, forgive me, but that is the general overview of my understanding of defensive layers in this game. So let's talk about what Assassin's defenses are, right? So there's 4 main keystones that have like some form of defensive layers on it. Mistwalker, Avoidance Layer. You gain elusive on critical strike. Again, elusive is an entropy effect, so it will lose effectiveness over time. And then you take no damage from critical strikes while elusive. Again, elusive has to go to 0 in order to remove itself and then refresh itself. Assuming you do not have like the Anoint or Oshabi's bloodline, which means that there is technically a small window where you will not be elusive, which means you will take extra damage from crits. It rarely comes up, but just know it exists. Opportunistic. Damage from critical strikes cannot be reflected, which means that if you're at 100% critical strike chance, you are reflect immune. If you are not at 100% crit strike chance, you are not 100% reflect immune. You are only whatever percentage it is. 35% less damage taken when there are 2 rare or unique enemies nearby. Again, you only get the damage reduction if you fulfill the condition, which means that there needs to be 2 rare or unique enemies nearby, which means if there's only 1 rare or only 1 unique enemy nearby, you do not gain any benefits with this. Also, you have to take 4 points because you have to path through assassination style in order to get to opportunistic. Next is going to be toxic delivery. Basically, it says per poison, which can theoretically stack infinitely, affecting enemies you kill. That means at the time of death, however many poison stacks they had on them, you recover 0.5% of life per poison stack. Requires you to kill the enemy and requires you to also poison them. But per poison stack affecting the enemy, you recover life. Shadowed Blood. 40% of physical damage taken, specifically physical damage and only physical damage, is recouped as life. So you have to get hit, and it has to be physical damage, and then 40% of it will be recouped over 4 seconds. You're unaffected by damaging ailments. While the damaging ailments can be put on you, you take no damage with them. Effectively, it's an immunity. Unaffected by, and like true immunity is a little bit different in like wordings. It matters for some things, but in general, it's effectively just an immunity, and you can treat it as such. Prior to this node, specifically Shadowed Blood, prior to Shadowed Blood, there is a small node which gives you increased max life. Again, hit pool is technically defenses. It falls under the defense category. All right. So, I've just covered a bunch of defenses. So why do people say Assassin has no defenses? Well, the short answer is that they're too conditional. Okay. Mistwalker requires you to be at 100% crit chance to consistently refresh it. And you can only refresh it after it reaches 0, and it loses effectiveness over time. So this is like the easiest to fulfill condition that is within your control, right? As a defensive layer. So this is an avoidance layer. Again, only delays how long it takes you to get hit. Elusive doesn't help you once you're hit, and it cannot refresh until it reaches 0, and you have to scale it through a bunch of different methods, right? And even if you scale it super high, it loses effectiveness over time, and eventually you will have to refresh it by critting again. So requirements for elusive, 100% crit chance, and then at 100% effectiveness, you only get 15% chance to dodge, some crit multi, as well as movement speed. Shadowed Blood requires you to be hit, right? Recovery layer requires you to be hit, only applies to physical damage. Not all damage, just physical damage. and we have no phys mitigation near our starting location, which means we have to path or get it on gear. Opportunistic. You are only reflect immune if you're at 100% crit chance. You take less damage only when there are two or more rare or unique enemies nearby. And it takes 4 ascendancies to path to, when prior to this update, it only took 2. You only have one small node, which is for 4% of life, right? So you're effectively scaling life if you're going if you're clicking on this, right? And if you choose not to, it's kind of a loss, but it's only 4% and it only shows up once in the ascendancy. That's the main thing. And then toxic delivery only gives you regen after you've killed the enemy and if you've poisoned them. There's other things that are around Assassin, which is like the limited hit pool nodes within the Ascendancy, limited mitigation nodes within the Ascendancy, limited recovery nodes within the Ascendancy starting location, not within the Ascendancy itself. Although there is that as well, right? You do get access to a lot of good quality leech nodes within the starting location towards like the bottom half of the tree, and pathing to those is quite useful for attack based assassin builds. And I don't want to downplay how good leech is, because it is quite good even after a lot of the nerfs, right? However, you don't have any armor nodes, you don't have that many large life nodes, you don't have that many large ES nodes. You have a few hybrid nodes and you have a few 10% nodes here and there. And I think a couple flat, but a majority of those are clustered either on the top side of the tree, towards like the top center left, and then a couple hybrid nodes on the top right, and then some pure life nodes on the bottom left of the tree. And then a good chunk of the armor nodes are also in like the bottom left area, as well as kind of like the bottom middle area as well. All right. So what are kind of my closing thoughts on all of this? Well, in an ideal world, we would just reduce some of the restrictiveness of the assassin's ascendancy to better give it defenses, right? An example of that would be Shadowed Blood. Let's say you want to keep the recoup mechanic, right? Even though we're already weak to getting hit. Let's just go ahead and make it generic. 40% generic life recoup. If you get hit by anything, you recoup 40%. That means when you eventually do take that fizz hit, right? You'll already have some recovery going, right, in the background from any previous hits that you've taken. Let's add a little bit more small life nodes to the Ascendancy, or small life ES nodes to the Ascendancy. Another example of this would be not tying so many things to crit and just having them be consistent. So like an example is like just make him have true reflect immunity in opportunistic, right? Make opportunistic only apply when there's only a rare or unique enemy rather than both, right? have opportunistic be accessible in 2 points, or just swap the places of assassination style and opportunistic. That way, you still have the, you know, 4 point pathing that you want, and uh, have an example of, like, the 2 point opportunistic like it was previously in the ascendancy. Uh, let's make the life regen per stack uh, on from per poison stack when enemies are killed. Let's just apply it to just have life regen per poison stack, right? And we don't have to kill the enemy to get some form of regeneration. Um, Mistwalker, allow uh, assassin to refresh it. Allow assassin to receive some form of benefits from it. So, like, an example would be, uh, you're while you have elusive, you don't take any extra damage from critical strikes, right? Rather than that, we just say, hey, while you're elusive, uh, you take reduced damage or reduced physical damage, right? This will make gearing assassin a little bit better. Uh, you know, an example of this would be, currently we have the assassin's mark, the level 30 assassin's mark. That doesn't really do anything for assassin, right? Hits can't be evaded. It's extremely underpowered as far as the the quality of that node is. You could take that and say, hey, um, if we're gonna like split the assassin ascendancy into two, right? We're gonna have like the generic version of it where if you're just stacking a bunch of crit multi, you'll go through, opportunistic through assassination style and whatever. And then we can change assassination style to be like, okay, while you're on full health, you get, more crit multi and more crit chance. And then while you're on low health, you can get more crit multi, uh, more crit chance. And effectively, now it's no longer a thing that you can't control, which is um, you like based off of enemies' health, right? You're going to do damage to them. Eventually, they're not going to be at full health, and eventually they will be at half health. Rather than doing that, it's just based off of what your stuff is, right? And then based off of like whether you're half health or whether you're low life or whether you're full life, right? Based off of that, opportunistic can provide you different like forms of damage reduction, where it says, or rather, not even opportunistic. We can just say opportunistic if, as long as there's like one rare enemy or whatever nearby. You get more damage and reduced damage taken, right? And then you're reflect immune. That can be fine, right? And then for uh, assassination style, it can be based off of whether you're low life and whether you're full life. And then whenever you leech damage on top of the assassination style, right? If you're full life, and then you uh, gain regen based off of if you're low life, right? Or recoup if you're low life, right? Because if you're low life, you're going to be using petrified blood. It gives us a little bit of synergy on that, right? Or with progenesis or whatever, right? And then we already have the generic uh, recoup from the rest of the ascendancy, and that section of the ascendancy can be life based, and top will be leech based, so generic damage leech. It can apply to ES or life or uh yeah, ES or life. And so, if you're going a ES build, it's in your best interest to click the full life one. And if you're going like a life based build, it's in your best interest to click the uh bottom one to get access to petrified blood. But if you're going like a life based build that is not a leech build, then it's better for you to click the top one or whatever, right? Um to then take that and then like, again, for the poison one, just based off of, hey, if you have poison stacks on them, you get some recovery, and you can then have certain archetypes of assassin where the idea is no longer to just stack like a bunch of um big poisons to do like a ton of damage. It's to stack a bunch of little poisons to get a lot of life recovery, right? um Again, with shadowed blood, you know reducing fizz damage would be one, or just reducing damage in general would be an example. We could say with like changing like the assassin's mark, you could make the current node, which is on assassin's mark, into a 2 node, and then you could put something along the lines of if you go uh, on the power charge side of the tree, per power charge you gain physical damage reduction, or per power charge you gain increased energy shield. Um, and then on the power charge node, we could probably put back some of the scaling that existed on the previous ascendancy, and just small stuff like that that removes these really weird conditionals that are just tied to the ascendancy into something more streamlined and a little bit more identity focused for assassin. Um, and you don't necessarily even have to go this route. This would just be making assassin objectively better. Uh, Maybe too good. Uh, that would be something that like the devs would have to look at and kind of compare on based off of whatever they're doing. But if we just want to keep the thematic identity of what an assassin is you go in, you kill, and you get out, right? Um, and that doesn't have to be tied to crit. So we could just drop the entire crit requirement to everything and just say, hey, if you are going poison, then you have your own, like, let's say the right side or the top side of the assassin tree. If you want to go crit, then you have the left side. And then if you want to not go crit, then you have the bottom side. And then the top side will have like, okay, you get some poison, and along with poison, you get a little bit of like some defenses. So, like, for instance, uh, gain flat armor per poison stack, and then uh, gain flat evasion per bleed stack or something like that, right? And then on the left side of the tree, which is like the crit based one, it can be like, okay, you know, every time you crit, you get elusive uh onslaught tailwind, and then your crit chance is lucky. Or actually, scratch that. Your crit chance is lucky, and then based off of whether you're full life or low life, you get like some sort of bonus effect whenever you crit. So generic leech if you're full life, or full ES or whatever, and then if you're low life, generic recoup or recovery or like regen or whatever. And then for like the bottom half, which is like the spell non-crit focused power charge based. Per power charge, you gain some sort of effect. So damage per power charge, AoE per power charge, um, Fizz mitigation per power charge, something along those lines, right? That could be an option if you wanted to. The other thing is like dual wielding is the thing in the game, right? So you could go and say, okay, assassins are not going to be using a shield. That thematically doesn't make sense, right? So you give them some benefits for saying, oh, if you're dual wielding uh, daggers, you get uh, increased spell block and um, attack block based off of your crit chance, uh, your local crit chance on the dagger. So, like for instance, if the local crit chance on the dagger is like 10, then you get uh 10 in addition to the, or it's a multiplier to the raw um attack block bonus that you get for dual wielding, right? Which is I think 20%. So if like let's say you had like 10, then it would just be uh 10 additional to that, so it'd be 30, right? That could make scaling a little bit easier. What's on the notes? Um, or when you're dual wielding it, your inherent bonuses apply to both, right? Another example of that would be bows, right? So like historically there have been, long range snipers throughout history, some of them using bows in uh different circumstances. So like you could have a bow section of it and then a claw dagger section of it and then one for status ailments like ignite, poison, and bleed. And that could be another option that you'd have. My main thing is to say, as like my final closing thoughts, the issues with Assassin's defenses is that they're conditional. They are limited in terms of how much mitigation that you receive, and this forces the player to try to make this up um, in either going pathing extremely far away from the starting location of the tree, or by trying to get as much defense as they can on gear, which then limits their ability to uh, get the character to scale holistically. And while there is a problem solving aspect to build making in Path of Exile, I think to the extent that it is for Assassin is a bit ridiculous because no class should have to um, sacrifice large amounts of anything in order to be able to achieve it uh, after spending multiple mirrors or hundreds of divines on a build, which is the current state of Assassin. Uh, you either go all into damage, and you can do that for very cheap, but you effectively have zero defenses, or you go and say, I will have a reasonable amount of defenses and damage, and you end up spending hundreds of divines or even mirrors um, to make the build function at the same state as other builds, which inherently have more of a luxury and freedom comparatively. That's it for the video. Um, if you have any feedback or if you have any corrections or anything that you would like to address, please leave them below. I do read them, and it is much appreciated. And have a nice day.